When looking at medieval Europe, you simply cannot separate kings from Christianity. Kings begin their career by being coronated by a bishop, then spend their rule under the guidance of the Pope, and justify their position in society by referring to something called divine right, which is the idea that the king is chosen by God to rule over his kingdom in the name of the Lord himself. The so-called divine right of kings has been used from Alfred the Great in 9th century England to Tsar Alexander of Russia in the 19th century. It's an idea that has prevailed for over 1,000 years, explicitly tying the king to the church. But at the same time, kings have to go to war, kings have to murder their siblings and rivals to maintain their rule, kings have to enact brutal punishments to those that break the law, and kings, of course, treated the sanctity of marriage as primarily a business arrangement used to solidify their power and position. And so, despite going hand in hand, the relationship between crown and church is complicated. So in this video, we'll be asking, in reality, how religious were medieval kings?
The king in society.
Before we dive into the religious aspect, you need to know a few things about kings and how society was run in medieval times. The king was the head of everything, and not like a modern king where the role is ceremonial and the government runs the country. For most of European history, the king was effectively in charge of the government. Actually, he was the government. Now, while he was the top guy in the country, and he was the one who got to make decisions, to survive as king in these brutal times, you had to be clever in how you ruled. Being a tyrant could only get you so far, so simply bulldozing everyone out of your way wasn't an option. Actually, it would probably only hasten your demise, so best stay away from that approach if you wish to avoid being assassinated. As the king, you would take advice from leading nobles who would form a type of advisory board known as the King's Council, and you'd have to spend time listening to what they had to say and their take on things. You needed to keep them on your side, as you never knew who may try to usurp you and take the throne. That threat of someone trying to kill you to improve their own life was very real, and so it's no wonder that kings during this period must have been some of the most paranoid people around. Anyway, back to describing how the king rules his country. Part of his advisory body would be the church. In medieval Europe, the church and its clerics were important figures, so you can already see that the Christian faith was implanted right in the heart of how a king would rule. The relationship was give and take. The king would further the interest of the church, and in exchange, the church would use their massive public influence to support the king.
The divine right of kings.
The church would help the king by legitimizing his rule and bolstering his reputation. This would come in the form of the divine right of kings, and it was a political doctrine that was used across medieval Europe. In short, it was something the kings used to claim that their power to rule came directly from God. This was crucial, as the king would also claim that they wouldn't be held responsible for any of their actions because they had authority from God to do whatever they needed to do. In other words, it's not me, it's God telling me to do this, which is a real get out of jail free card for them to play. Also, it was something they would go on to abuse, which does throw into question how they viewed their own religion, as they saw it more as a means to get what they wanted than a genuine question of personal faith. Nonetheless, it was extremely powerful and publicly accepted as a reasonable and sensible state of affairs. At the top of the chain is God, and since God is almighty, it would make sense that the next person down the chain of command would have been hand-selected to rule. Richard I, who will become important later in this video, once said, "Deu et mon droit," God and my right, which still remains the motto of the royal family today. To his subjects, the king would proclaim he was the representative of God on earth. To oppose the king is to oppose God, and if you were living in Europe during the medieval period, you would have no reason not to believe he was both king and, dare we say it, God on earth. It was also common for medieval kings to have another title, the Defender of the Faith. Within England, this title is actually something that's set in law, and it's something that was used even during the coronation of King Charles III. Even today, the king remains the head of the church in the UK. The term itself first appears in 1507 in Scotland during the reign of King James IV. He was given the title Protector and Defender of the Christian Faith by Pope Julius II, and Henry VIII was then given his own version of the title in 1521 by Pope Leo X. After a short break in its usage during the Reformation and Civil War, the title has been included in the official name of the ruling monarch ever since. So, if you want to use the full title, it's Charles III, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of his other realms and territories, King, Head of the Commonwealth, Defender of the Faith. So, to us, it seems kind of obvious that kings must have been personally religious. They depended on this belief system to justify their rule and took on the responsibility of defending their faith as part of the job description. But before we dive too deeply into the psychology of individual kings, we need to zoom out and take a look at the society that they lived in.
The culture of medieval Europe.
If you want to gain some real understanding of how religion was placed in medieval Europe, you need to know more about the general culture that existed at this time. It was completely different from what we see as our culture today, and there were several cultures at once, since in medieval times, what you said and did would change massively depending on your status in society. Anybody in the peasant class would certainly have had a completely different experience of life compared to, say, the nobility. During 11th century Britain, the ruling class were culturally French, while the peasants were culturally English. This is why even today in English-speaking countries, the French version of the word is often considered the posh, sophisticated option, while the English version is run-of-the-mill, working class. Ask in English, inquire in French. Help, aid, hide, conceal, buy, purchase. That's why it's a cow or a pig when it's in the field, where the peasants hang out, and it's beef or pork on the table, which is where the nobles hang out. So, big differences. But there was one thing that united these social classes throughout society, and that was, you guessed it, Christianity. Regardless of your social standing, everyone would have had a shared worldview on some of the basic questions about life and the world around them. Christianity was the only game in town when it came to ideas, and it was absolutely everywhere. Or was it? See, there's no doubt that Christian values were sown throughout medieval culture, and they did play a part in everyday life. But the idea that the church had the final say on everything is a bit of a myth, actually. Europe had a pretty unique mix of supernatural and spiritual ideas outside of the church. People believed in things like fairies and pixies, and there was a blend of pagan superstition and folklore, all mixed up alongside Christianity. This existed even centuries after Christianity became the religion of a European country. It seems that old habits and beliefs were passed down through the generations, even when the church played a predominant role in life. You might think that the church, with their inquisitions and heresy trials and witch hunting and fundamentalism, would have been keen to stomp these unchristian beliefs out of people, but in reality, they didn't really have much of a problem with it. In fact, despite their reputation for being total control freaks, the church didn't mind a lot of things. There were other parts of culture that would undoubtedly be classed as unchristian, and the church seemed perfectly fine with it. One particular unchristian feature of medieval Europe that the church were happy to let slide was the nobility and warrior class of society.
Knights and nobles.
For these folks, killing someone to preserve your status was just part of the culture. If you had to kill someone to further your own self, then that was seen as being absolutely fair, but certainly not very Christian. Of course, if you were a peasant, this didn't apply to you, but the ruling elite could effectively do what they wanted, and they certainly never looked upon it as causing a problem with their religious beliefs. Actually, if you were a peasant and carried out the same acts as the elite, you would potentially be executed, while the elite would be praised for showing character. But if you think that was bad, there's more. The culture within medieval Europe towards adultery and having mistresses was completely different to what you might expect from a Christian kingdom. Having mistresses when you were in a position of power was seen almost as your right. To some, it was a positive virtue and a way to showcase your prestige. Also, there was an understanding that husbands from lower societal positions had to give up their wives if someone from the higher echelons wanted them. This was especially true if the king set his eyes upon a woman he wanted. It would be a tough call for the current husband to say no to him. It could often be more than your life was worth if you had found yourself in that position. Perhaps the best way to describe culture in these times is that it was morally flexible. You could easily have a king who was admired and respected for being peace-loving and austere and having only one wife, while another king could be held in the same regard even if he was prone to violence and greed and had more mistresses than days of the week. It's a tricky one to wrap your head around, but it's kind of how society worked centuries ago, and there was more to being a good king than just being a good Christian. But it wasn't like you could do anything you liked. There were still some things that people saw as wrong.
The concept of sin.
A huge part of Christianity is the concept of sin. A sin is an act which goes against the will and laws of God and was believed to result in being sent to hell for eternity. So it's something you want to avoid doing. But like we said earlier, if adultery and violence are some form of virtue, then what does that mean for sin during this period? History has shown us that the idea of sin did play a massive role in society during the medieval period. But also, people believed in penance, so you could do bad things and still possibly avoid God's judgment. Yet, as always in this time, how you viewed sin and what you did to avoid it depended on where you were in society. If you were at the bottom, the weight of worrying about sin could be overwhelming. But further up the ladder, well, let's just say the elite had the idea that they could work their way out of it. In the medieval period, society accepted that people would commit sins and that it was in our imperfect human nature to do so, which again made things quite relaxed. After all, if sin was to be expected, then it's not something you need to panic about all the time. Sin is gonna happen, so sometimes you need to let it happen and then deal with it afterwards with penance. But like all things, penance was different compared to the elite and the peasants. Take William the Conqueror as a perfect example of how penance could work during this period. William was a Christian, and he knew that his conquest of England would result in many people dying. He was quoted as saying these exact lines before the Battle of Hastings in 1066. "I make a vow on this very battlefield. I shall found a monastery for the salvation of all, and especially for those who fall here, to the honour of God and his saints, where servants of God may be supported, a fitting monastery, with a worthy liberty. Let it be an atonement, a haven, for all as free as the one I conquer for myself." But he wasn't alone in carrying out these kind of acts. Kings and the elite would simply use their money to effectively buy their way into heaven. Well, that's what they thought anyway, and when you believe you can do this, it makes it easier for you to contend with the sins you're committing. Eternal damnation doesn't sound quite as scary when you can just toss a few coins at the church and have it all forgotten about.
The Church in Middle Ages.
Now, despite this moral flexibility that we've discussed, the influence of the church can't be overstated. Yes, people had their own pagan superstitions, and yes, the church sometimes permitted unchristian behaviours, but it was still absolutely the hegemon of daily life and intellectual thought. Philosophers from the era known as the Age of Reason, including David Hume, Immanuel Kant and Voltaire, referred to the Middle Ages as the Age of Faith due to the extent to which religion played a role in society. This was a period when the Catholic Church held enormous power, well up until the Reformation, and people would look to the church to explain pretty much everything. If you were alive at that time, you would lean on the church and the clergy for spiritual support, and perhaps even financial support if you were poor. You would listen to the clergy and follow what they said. After all, they were representing God and knew what God wanted, so it would be ridiculous to ignore them. Because of this, there was an overwhelming feeling that everything happened in the world because God did it, which to some sounds like a get out of everything clause, but it was the belief held by almost everyone in the Middle Ages. People would look to God if there was a storm, if someone was ill, or if there was a famine. And the church was at the centre of it all, right in the heart of the community, with what must have felt like constant religious services, while church buildings were also used as locations for village or town meetings. The church was often one of the few places where people could receive treatment if they were sick, and it provided some people with a form of education based on faith, and in general, did what it could to help the poor. With the church playing such an integral part in everyday life, it's no surprise that religion, therefore, played a really strong role in daily living for the average person. But what about the king? How was his relationship with the church, and how did that relationship begin in the first place?
The King and Christianity.
If we dive deeper into history, we'll get to a period where the king would have been the head of a pagan country, but that will change in a time known as the Dark Ages, when Christianity took hold across Europe. We're not going to go into how Christianity spread, as that's a whole other topic right there, but basically, Christianity in Europe led to a significant change in how the king would view the world. Also, if the king viewed the world differently, it would usually mean that his subjects would need to follow suit. Keep in mind that the pagan religions kings used to follow would mean they had a number of different gods they would worship, and they would quite often be violent gods. Just look at the Vikings, for example. They followed gods which demanded human sacrifices to appease them. That's hardly something a Christian king would want to do. You couldn't get any further away from the idea of Christianity than sacrificing a human for religious purposes. But the early Christian missionaries weren't stupid. They knew the best way to get Christianity into the land was to target the king. If they could convert the king to Christianity, the people would follow. One of the earliest stories of a pagan king being converted comes from the Anglo-Saxon world, and it concerns King Ethelbert, who ruled from 587 to 616. Don't make the mistake of thinking he was the first Christian in the country. There were some Christians scattered around the Anglo-Saxon world thanks to different missionaries landing in various places, but they were relatively small in number. But according to the Anglo-Saxon texts, Ethelbert would eventually convert after enough pressure from his wife, Berta, who was the daughter of a Merovingian Frankish king who had already converted to Christianity. Anglo-Saxon sources state that part of Berta's requirement for marrying Ethelbert was that she could freely participate in her religion. This was a big deal as it went against what Ethelbert himself believed, but it seems he accepted this to have access to her father, who was the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. It really was a small price to pay to have such a strong ally on your side. But Ethelbert would also encounter the missionary Augustine, who appeared in Thanet in the year 597. Augustine had been sent there by Pope Gregory with the aim of converting the nobles that ruled the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It said that 10,000 people would then convert and be baptised after Ethelbert had taken the plunge and become a Christian himself, which would have been a considerable success in the eyes of the missionary and the Pope when he heard about it. But this tale also gives us a great example of how the church would also benefit from the king. After his conversion, Ethelbert would give land to Augustine to build an abbey. The place? Canterbury, which would then lead to Canterbury Cathedral and the start of the close relationship between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king. However, upon his death in 616, his son Eadbald took over as king, and he quickly reverted back to being a pagan. As you can imagine, the church was not happy about this idea, but at some point it turned out that Eadbald converted back to Christianity and everything was kosher from there. From the perspective of the church, they had to ensure that they could maintain a certain sense of power and have the ability to bend the ear of the king. They didn't want things to, once again, slide back into paganism. The church had won some easy victories by convincing kings to become Christian, but a king was just one man, and one man can change his mind. So now, the church would begin to focus on the people too. If the church could make the people of the land Christian, then they would ensure the king couldn't become a pagan, and they'd be able to influence the monarch of that land.
Leading church figures advising the crown.
The church's plan was immensely successful. See, if you lived in these times, your faith would have played a major role in your life. You would judge the world through, more or less, a Christian lens. So, for a ruler, it was essential to understand Christianity in order to effectively govern their Christian subjects. So the king ensured he had access to leading church figures who could offer advice and guidance on key parts of ruling the country. The king knew that the people would follow what the clergy was saying, so it was an easy way for him to effectively maintain control over the population without doing too much work. And so a symbiotic relationship was born. The church needed the king to protect their faith and spread the religion, and the king needed the church to advise him on religious matters and keep him popular with the people. It now became increasingly common for members of the church to be in prominent political positions across Europe. Just think about Cardinal Richelieu in France during the reign of King Louis XIII. He was able to push forward ideas of the church whilst also having an impact on political policies. Now that we've got a really solid idea of the role of church in society and morality, and the relationship between religion and monarchs, let's start taking a look at some examples of how this all played out. So we can start by asking that original question: how personally religious were kings? Take the example of Henry IV of France. Henry IV was born a Catholic, but his mother was a Protestant, and he was brought up more with his Protestant faith. This put him at odds with the Catholic Church, which eventually led to his assassination in 1610 at the hands of a Catholic extremist named Francois Ravaillac, who stabbed the king in his coach when he was held up by a large crowd. But here's the amazing thing. This was the 12th assassination attempt. There had been 11 failed attempts to take his life before they finally got him. And the reason that so many people had wanted him dead was religious. Henry IV used his faith in an attempt to play both sides of the debate. See, at the time, France was fraught with divisions between Protestant and Catholic Christians, and Henry would make a big show out of trying to appeal to both sections of society. On one day, he'd say a bunch of things that made the Catholics happy, and the next, he'd start buttering up the Protestants. Henry was playing with the religious emotions of both sides to further his own political career, but instead of making friends of enemies, he made enemies of his friends, and was a prime target for both Protestants and Catholics who came to see him as a traitor. We mentioned earlier that there had been 12 total attempts on his life, and they had come from both sides of the religious divide. Now ask yourself, does that behaviour sound like someone who was really invested in their religious beliefs, or is something else going on here? It looked as though the king was using faith as a means to protect his power, and not using his power as a means to protect the faith. Let's take a look at a slightly more complicated story.
Thomas Becket.
The story of Thomas Becket is a perfect example of what happens if you make an enemy of the king. Back in 1162, Thomas Becket was made Archbishop of Canterbury by Henry II, which meant he was the most prominent member of the church in the whole of England. It also meant he was one of the most important people in the entire country. Through the king, Becket now had enormous influence over England. The relationship between Henry and Becket was a close one. They were childhood friends, and long before Henry came to the throne, they were said to hunt and play chess together. Becket was a calm individual, and this seemed to help Henry, who was always known to be slightly volatile, even at a relatively young age. Despite their close relationship though, Becket and Henry's lives were always destined to go in different directions. But Henry made sure he used Becket to his advantage after coming to the throne. After all, he trusted him, which was a really rare commodity for a king. Becket had gone on his own path after childhood and had been to Rome on several occasions to visit the Pope. After becoming king, Henry would then appoint him as his chancellor prior to his promotion to the archbishop role, which would occur in 1161 after his predecessor, Theobald of Bec, succumbed to a long illness. It seems that Henry decided Becket could take on a dual role of both chancellor and archbishop, and Henry thought that Becket would return the favour by siding with the king on important matters. Well, that was the theory, but it wouldn't turn out as straightforward as Henry had hoped, and it didn't take long before Becket and Henry would start butting heads. The issue for Becket was that he felt overwrought with the idea of being both chancellor and archbishop, and so he resigned from the chancellor position by the latter part of 1162. Keep in mind that this is only a year since he was promoted to the role of archbishop. It's said that Becket resigned the chancellor position because he wanted to focus on building the strength and prominence of the church, and that this was his primary objective. Henry, of course, was not pleased with the idea. He had hoped to keep Becket as a close political ally that he could use to influence further proceedings. Now Becket's resignation came as a huge slap in the face, and the relationship between the two men began to sour. Henry had felt safe having a lifelong friend in two of the most powerful positions in the land, and so suddenly losing him from one of these positions was not something he'd anticipated, and it left him politically weak. If we jump forward a couple of years to 1164, we can begin to see tensions between the church and King Henry bubbling up. At the time, members of the clergy were able to be tried in their own ecclesiastical courts if they'd broken the law. These courts were extremely lenient with their punishments, which meant that the justice system wasn't working properly. Henry proposed that clergymen accused of crimes would need to appear in the royal courts so that they could be appropriately punished. But Becket flat out opposed the king and argued that the church should have the right to try their own clergymen as they saw fit. This led to what was known as the Constitutions of Clarendon, which would see Henry gain more power over the bishops and less power from the church. As you can imagine, Becket was not too impressed with this idea, and he openly stated that he was not willing to accept these new laws. Henry now had his childhood friend and trusted colleague openly disobeying him from a position of power that Henry himself had elevated him to. Their relationship completely shattered, and as a result, Becket felt he had no option but to flee to France while still holding the role of Archbishop of Canterbury. While Becket was in France, Henry II had another problem come up. For completely unrelated reasons, Henry went into a complete crisis of succession when it came to the subject of who would inherit his throne after his death. He needed to coronate his son as a junior king, but the Archbishop of Canterbury, Becket, was away in France. Henry grabbed the lesser bishop and had him coronate his son in order to solve the succession crisis. But when Becket heard about this, he was totally enraged, since this was the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury and someone else had taken the job. Becket's anger went so far that he started excommunicating any bishop that had been involved in what he saw as a sham coronation. While it may have made him feel better, it certainly didn't help his relationship with Henry, who was now, once again, furious with Becket. It's believed by many that this act led to the eventual downfall of Thomas Becket. Enraged at what he saw as yet another sign of personal and political betrayal, Henry is said to have shouted, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" Whether or not he meant this to suggest someone should murder the Archbishop is something that's been debated for centuries since. However, this phrase opened the door for someone to take action against Becket to gain favour with the king. The story goes that 4 knights heard the king utter the phrase and decided they should be the one to do something about it. Jumping on their horses, they rode to Canterbury before bursting into the cathedral and shouting the words, "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and the kingdom?" After finding Becket, they struck him 3 times with their swords, leaving him dead in the cathedral. It was a horrific death, as described by the monk Edward Grimm, who bore witness to the attack. The final blow was described in the following way. But the 3rd knight inflicted a grave wound on the fallen one. With this blow, he shattered the sword on the stone of his crown, which was large, separated from his head, so that the blood turned white from the brain, yet no less did the brain turn red from the blood. So, why are we even telling you the story of Thomas Becket? Well, it's not a common occurrence for the Archbishop of Canterbury to be slaughtered inside his own cathedral, so that's a good enough reason on its own, but it's not the only reason. There's something else that ties it into what this entire video is about. How religious were kings? Keep in mind that the king saw himself as God's representative on earth, not the head cleric for the church. Henry had no problem at least hinting at the possibility of someone going ahead and killing Becket, and that in itself would surely go against his religious beliefs. Well, it depends who you ask. Henry was said to have been initially horrified at the slaying of Becket and starved himself for 3 days as a penance. He was also said to have worn a sackcloth and ashes. But what the story shows is the king still believed he could do anything in his apparent power to preserve his reign. If this involved an individual being killed within the confines of the holiest site in England, then that's what had to happen. Remember, unless it was something that was reasonably imaginable, then Henry's thugs wouldn't have just jumped to the conclusion that his outburst of, "Won't someone get rid of this guy?" meant that they should go and kill him, and they didn't even bother to double check with the king that that's what he wanted first. Also, don't forget that the breakdown in the relationship between Henry and Becket all started when Henry tried to remove some of the power from the church and Becket refused. That solitary stand against the power of the king would unknowingly set into motion the wheels of something that would lead to murder. Yes, kings would take actions that would result in the death of members of the clergy, and it was all in the name of preserving their own power. It seems likely to us that Henry's mourning at the death of Becket was more to do with losing a close personal friend and less to do with the fact that he had betrayed a personal religious principle. But there is an even more famous story regarding religious faith and the king from England, and it involves another Henry, perhaps the most famous king to have ever lived, Henry VIII.
Henry VIII. Everything changes.
No discussion about kings and religion could be complete without us diving into the Tudor period and mentioning the infamous Henry VIII. After all, he was responsible for what became known as the English Reformation. As a child, Henry was a devout Catholic. He would even go ahead and defend the Pope, who was under attack by the German theologian Martin Luther. This often comes as a surprise to some people who are led to believe that Henry VIII was always against the Catholic Church, when the reality is something completely different. One of the main problems with Henry VIII was his tyrannical behaviour. Nowadays, he would perhaps be viewed as like a narcissist, but that's hardly surprising when you grow up destined to be king and know everyone has to basically agree with everything you say. This way of seeing the world would eventually lead to problems between Henry and the Catholic Church as soon as they stood in his way regarding his personal life. He was not used to anybody saying no to him, and he didn't take kindly to it happening when it did. But we need to dive back in time to when everything was rosy between Henry and the Catholic Church. It's well known that he went to daily mass and even ventured on pilgrimages to various holy sites around England. Henry would also write books about his Catholic faith, with the most important being Defence of the Seven Sacraments, where he would stand up against the new wave of Christianity, Protestantism. This stance that he took against Martin Luther led to him receiving special titles from the Pope himself, which was a great honour. Henry would be referred to as Fideo Defensor, or Defender of the Faith, which is a lofty claim to fame, even though, as we said earlier, he wasn't the first to receive this title. Yet this love affair between Henry and the Catholic Church was destined to not last forever. Instead, things would change the moment Henry didn't get his way in life, something he wasn't used to. And as soon as that happened, he would seek revenge.
Henry, divorce, and his faith.
People often assume that Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church because he wanted a divorce and knew his Catholic faith would not allow it. That is partly true, but it's not the full story. The problem with Henry was that he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon as they only had a daughter named Mary, and he was absolutely desperate to have a male heir to the throne. So, in his eyes, the best thing to do was to divorce his wife and marry someone else who could supply him with that all-important son. Exactly how he felt changing wives would make a difference remains a historical mystery. Anyway, to get a divorce, Henry believed he would have to go to the main person in charge, the Pope. Pope Clement VII was in charge at the time, and in 1529 he allowed Henry to have his marriage effectively put on trial in England. The Pope didn't give a yes or no answer, but he at least gave Henry a chance to argue why he should be allowed to annul his marriage. This would have been the trial of the century, and the Pope sent one of his most trusted advisors in Cardinal Campeggio to oversee the trial. After all, we are talking about one of the most important kings in the whole of Europe, so the Pope would want to know things had been handled correctly. Both Henry and Catherine were given time to put across their side of the story. Henry told the trial his reasons for wishing to end the marriage, but Catherine made it very clear that she wanted to remain with Henry. Those involved in the trial then discussed the matter in line with both the law and the Bible to try and come to a conclusion, but it wasn't the ending Henry wanted. The Pope informed him he couldn't annul his marriage for several reasons. First, Henry argued that he had married his brother's widow, so this would clearly be a sin, and if you married in sin, then you should surely be allowed to annul it. But it turns out there's a verse in Deuteronomy that kind of allows for that sort of thing, and so this argument was rejected. It was a pretty sloppy reason to slap down the divorce. After all, this line in Deuteronomy isn't totally clear, and the Pope had the right to interpret the Bible as he saw fit. So why did the Pope side against the king, the guy he had once named the defender of the faith? Well, for the Pope, there was something else that meant his hands were tied, and it was thanks to the family of the other person involved in the divorce trial, Catherine. Catherine of Aragon belonged to an extremely important Catholic family, and the Pope knew her family wouldn't be happy if he annulled the marriage. Actually, her nephew was Charles V, who was a highly influential figure across Europe at the same time as Henry. Charles V had taken his army into Italy in 1525 when Pope Clement was being held captive in the Castle St. Angelo. If the Pope had gone ahead and told Henry he could divorce Catherine, he would have made a sworn enemy out of Charles V. If he forced Henry to stay married, he would have made an enemy of Henry. The Pope reasoned that his most important ally was Charles, and so he sided with Catherine in order to preserve his relationship with Charles V. This video is supposed to be about whether or not kings were religious, but this little tidbit makes you wonder if even the Pope was personally religious, since he was allowing matters of the church, faith, and morality to be dictated by the political situation around him. Regardless of the Pope's reasoning, Henry was furious. From that point on, Henry and his religious faith were on a collision course, and it could only head in one direction. Henry initially sought to find other ways to annul the marriage, but by 1533 he was becoming even angrier with the situation. This led him to creating the Act of Supremacy in 1534, where he himself ended his marriage. Why bother trying to stick to the rules if you're king and you can simply make your own rules to suit yourself? This is a perfect example of how medieval kings could claim to be religious and yet change their mind about things when they didn't get their way. In some ways, they could be almost ultra-religious until they got to the point where they felt it simply wasn't working for them. But don't think that the only reason Henry split from Catholicism was due to him wanting a divorce. Instead, another woman also played a role. That woman was Anne Boleyn, which is a name you may be familiar with, and it's one of his most famous wives. Anne Boleyn was a lady-in-waiting for Catherine, but Henry began to have eyes for her as far back as 1526, believing she would be the one to deliver a son. He quickly became romantically interested in her, but being married was clearly an issue. Tudor sources tell us that Anne had previously been exposed to Martin Luther's ideas, and she certainly had some influence over Henry. It seems weird to think that someone influenced by Martin Luther could affect Henry at all, considering that he'd written a book against Luther some years earlier. But his desire to protect the throne would be stronger than his religious conviction. This idea of Protestantism was gaining some more traction in Tudor England. By 1531, it's known that Henry asked for different Protestant thinkers and academics to compile religious works that would be helpful to him. It led to a book called Collectanea Satis Corpisia, which basically stated Henry had the absolute right to annul his marriage and it wouldn't affect his religion. With that sense of justification behind him, you can see why Henry felt he had the absolute right to do what he wanted. Despite being a zealous Catholic in his youth, Protestantism became instantly appealing as soon as he realised he could use it as a tool to expand his own power. This Protestant think tank would continue to help Henry in other ways. Henry also saw how wealthy the church was, and he wanted some of that wealth going his way. So in the following years, he made sure to strip the church of much of its wealth and power so that he could be the sole beneficiary of it all. By 1533, Henry had managed to strip assets from the Catholic Church, seize land, close down monasteries, and also remove the power of the Pope. Henry would now be the top guy with the final say regarding the church, and to ensure people accepted this, he introduced the Treason Act in 1534, where anybody questioning his power would be executed. Henry VIII is one of our best examples for us to look at when we ask ourselves about the religious beliefs of individual kings. He was educated, he was a firm Catholic, he was a voracious reader of religious texts, he even wrote books on religious matters that were respected in his time. To an outsider looking in, Henry would have seemed like the perfect Christian to sit on the throne. And then, in an instant, he would swallow the Catholic Church's wealth, influence and institutions in order to further his own political ambitions whilst using Protestantism as an excuse and justification for all of these acts. It's hard to imagine that Henry could have acted that way if he was genuinely a Christian and genuinely lived in fear of God.
'Twas not just a king.
Henry VIII figured that he'd solved the issue of who would follow him, leading to his son Edward coming to the throne and ruling as Edward VI. But after coming to the throne at age 9, Edward died of tuberculosis at the age of 15. Of course, being only 15 at his death meant he had no ability to produce an heir, so the throne would have to pass to the next in line, his sister, Mary. However, Edward knew his time was coming to an end and he had other ideas, and Mary was not at the top of his list. Mary is also known in history as Bloody Mary, and when you learn about what she did during her reign, it becomes obvious why she earned that moniker. Upon Edward VI's death, there was a campaign to have his cousin Lady Jane Grey take the throne. She was a strong follower of the Protestant faith, and it was viewed as a chance to have some continuity after the English Reformation. Mary, on the other hand, had other ideas. Gathering together support from her followers, Mary rode to London with the sole purpose of taking control. After reaching London, Mary immediately executed Lady Jane Grey and her husband. She had been queen for a grand total of 9 days. Executing 2 people to become queen is hardly something a pious, gentle, religious person would do, and if you think that's shocking, it didn't stop there. The difference with Mary was with her faith. She was a Catholic, and she was pretty upset that the Catholic Church had lost its position of power as a result of the Reformation. So she went out of her way to try anything she could do to ensure the Catholic Church would get back to its previous position. Over the course of her reign, which lasted just 5 years, Mary would execute 280 people just because they were Protestant and refused to convert back to Catholicism. Most would be tied to a stake and set alight, while over 800 other influential people would flee to Europe to stop themselves from meeting the same fate. All of her attempts to push the Catholic Church back into the limelight would eventually end in disaster though. After failing to produce an heir, Mary would be forced into decreeing that her sister, the Protestant Elizabeth, would be her heir.
The woes of the crown. War and law.
When people think about being king, they tend to focus on all the positives. Having people waiting after you hand and foot, living in luxurious palaces, and having more money than you could ever imagine. But being a king in the medieval period was a bit different. Sure, you had all those positives, but there was also an ugly side to being king, and it honestly didn't line up with their religious faith. You can take law and order in the medieval period as a perfect example. During this time, there were typically 4 different types of punishment for anybody deemed to have broken the law: fines, public humiliation, corporal punishment, and execution. The fines part wouldn't pose a problem from a faith perspective, but the others, well, you can probably see how they might not line up with Christian values. But before we go any further, you need to quit with this idea that people were being executed en masse during this period. Yes, execution was a punishment, but it was still a last resort, reserved for the most serious of crimes like murder and treason. If you want to know more about the specifics of medieval punishment and when and why they were used, you can check out our video here. But now, let's get back. But it wasn't just the brutality of law and order we need to talk about. The king was also helped out when it came to enforcing this law by the church, as the church set up their own courts with the blessing of the king. Within these courts, the church never gave out the death penalty, and people would be forced into giving an apology at mass, or they had to go on a pilgrimage. This may not sound like much, but the church played such an integral role in daily living that people respected and obeyed what the church said. The fact so many crimes would be passed to the church court would in itself be a blessing for the king. It helped maintain a sense of law and order, it became part of the judicial system, but it also allowed the king to keep his hands clean. This also meant a lot of law and order in the medieval period was handled on more of a local basis. The king would certainly leave most things to the community, as he would have to focus on larger issues. Yet the overwhelming idea behind punishments at this time was to deter people from breaking the law thanks to the clearly harsh outcomes. Being whipped, locked in stocks, and even having your hands or feet removed as punishment would occur. And as king, you would have the power to stop these types of punishments occurring if you so wished. But a lot of times in history, the king did not wish. Instead, kings would argue that these punishments had nothing to do with religion or their faith, but were connected to the regulation of society. In other words, kings were recognising that there was a conflict between their religious values and the secular demands of rulership. This uncomfortable compromise between personal religious belief and the job of being king would also be seen in another widely popular pastime during the medieval period: war. Medieval Europe was a time of warfare. Battles took place on what sometimes felt like a constant basis, which at times felt more like a hobby to the elitist than an actual war. Life appeared to be cheap. Surely, warfare and the mass killings of individuals in battle would go against Christian values. So how would they justify it? The church would surely be against the idea of going to war, crusades aside, but kings had different ideas. To the king, going into battle was never about religion. So if it wasn't about religion, then it wouldn't go against their faith. Instead, most battles were about gaining land or dealing with security. Also, the king would tend to always have the church on his side, which is a point we will cover shortly. It's the same argument that the king would use regarding laws and punishments. It only involved your religion if it was specifically connected to that subject. The church would often argue on behalf of the king that different battles had to occur as the enemy was going against what the church believed, and in that way, the king would be viewed as some type of saviour and coming to the aid of the church. Considering the church was already promoting the idea that the king had been appointed by God, then this vision of him riding into battle with the backing of the church must have made individuals feel they were fighting alongside God himself. And so war was either a totally secular practice which didn't involve religious considerations, or it was openly sanctioned by the church and so was itself a religious act. Kings could comfortably go to war where they would order the death of thousands without having to prick their religious conscience.
The church and the king working together.
Kings in the medieval period may have attended mass and participated in various religious rites, but they also managed to do their fair share of anti-Christian acts throughout their reign. This opens up a question of how the church was able to cope with a king that was obviously doing things that they should be strictly against. So, were the church and the king effectively working together in some way? Definitely. Well, sort of. They definitely worked hand in hand, and both parties knew what the other could give and what it meant for their survival. For the king, he would be able to continue ruling in the idea that he was ordained by God and had the church's backing. In exchange, the king was responsible for ensuring the church was free to hold power and influence in the land. He had the ability to give them more land and resources, and the ability to build their finances. If the church did anything to upset the king, they would make life harder for themselves. But this isn't to say the church always turned a blind eye to things that the king or other nobles would do that went against their religious beliefs. At times, the church stood strong against the actions of others. Take the stories of both Philippe I and Philippe II of France. The church managed to excommunicate them both after they married other women and had affairs, and they weren't the only kings from France to fall foul of this. Actually, Philippe II was forced to give up one relationship and had to go back to his second wife, Ingeborg of Denmark, at the behest of the church. Robert II tried to marry his second cousin, Bertha of Burgundy, but the church quickly put a stop to that idea. Instead, Robert annulled 3 marriages, which meant that he went against the wishes of the Pope. But we're not finished talking about France and their love for affairs. Next, we need to talk about William IX. William IX was also known as the Duke of Aquitaine, and he didn't have the best relationship with the church. Actually, he had the honour of being excommunicated twice, which is quite an achievement. The first time was due to some issues with tax and the church when he threatened to kill the bishops of Poitiers in 1114. The second excommunication was a bit more serious, as William was involved in abducting a woman who he wanted to marry, even though she was already married. Some historians believe the woman involved was pretty keen on the abduction, but it was still enough for the Pope to go ahead and throw him out of the church. But don't sit there thinking it was just the French. The Spanish were just as bad. Ramon Berenger I of Barcelona found himself on the wrong side of Pope Victor II after he indulged in an affair while married to his second wife. After marrying his mistress, they were both excommunicated. But we also have something else to say about good old Ramon. He also kidnapped a woman by the name of Almondis of La Marche and married her. Almondis herself committed not just bigamy, but double bigamy, which led to excommunication. It's honestly a bit of a strange one. At times the church would certainly look the other way, but then they would clamp down on bad behaviour. Monastic sources will often talk about various mistresses, where they would even go so far as to refer to them as whores, which is hardly the kind of language you would expect to hear from monks. There is even a case in which the Bishop of Lincoln ordered the removal of the tomb of Rosamund de Clifford simply because she was the mistress of Henry II. Actually, the bishop stated that this was because she was a harlot and that she had to be buried away from the church. The bishop went on to state that she was to be buried with the rest, that the Christian religion may not grow into contempt, and that other women, warned by her example, may abstain from illicit and adulterous intercourse. Of course, this knowledge that you were committing adultery, which is clearly a massive sin in Christianity, didn't exactly stop various kings from committing it. Again, it's an example of how they would effectively pick and choose which parts of their faith they wanted to indulge in at any time. So, were kings as religious as we think? There's no doubt that they were religious, but at the same time it often comes across that they also believed they were above religion. When you look at the murders that took place at the behest of the king, the cruel punishments meted out to individuals under the reign, and just generally doing un-Christian things, it does appear they would effectively pick and choose which parts they liked and which parts they wanted to ignore. At the end of the day, the most important thing to the majority of kings during this period was to continue their reign until the day they died. Remember, it's not like it is now, where the king's almost guaranteed to reign until he dies. In medieval times, the king was constantly paranoid about the possibility of others trying to usurp him, so he had to do anything he could to survive. At those times, you can kind of understand why the king would act in a particular way. Let's face it, how would you act if you were constantly having to contend with potential treachery and people wanting to kill you? And the knowledge that if you died, the entire realm could be plunged into chaos and violence.